So Steve, thank you for participating in the Barry War Museum and Heritage Centre Human Library. Although you yourself were not alive during World War II, your parents were, and you have many stories to share that they passed on to you.
My parents were from the Grangetown area of Cardiff, and by the time war broke out, they had both left school. My father lived in the bottom end of Clive Street in Grangetown, right on the junction of Clive Street, Ferry Road, York Place, South Clive Street and Homesdale Street. My mother at the time was living with her parents in Tennant Street at the top end of Grangetown. As I say, they had both left school, they were about 15 years of age. My father went into employment as a shipwright. My mother worked for the Western Mail and Echo, the local newspaper.
So you said your dad was a shipwright, so where did he work then, Steve?
Yes, my father was a shipwright, which is basically a ship's carpenter, trained to make and repair shipping. Obviously earlier on wooden ships, but there's still a lot of woodwork and carpentry in the wartime ships and indeed modern ships. So he was working on Penarth docks. Yeah, my dad's name being Jack. His next brother up was Clifford, he was a bricklayer. Then there was my Uncle Bill. He was also, as I say, the shipwright working, I believe, in Cardiff docks at the time. And the elder brother, Sidney. Uncle Sid, he was the shipwright that went to sea in the Merchant Navy.
So his brothers were older than him, I'm presuming?
Yes, he was a younger brother.
And how about on your mother's side? What brothers and sisters did she have who may have participated in World War II?
Yes, my mother, she had two sisters and two brothers. The two brothers, one was in the Territorial Army, so on war breaking out, he was mobilised. He was in the Royal Signals. Her other brother, my Uncle Charlie, he was in the Merchant Navy also. And when war broke out, he actually jumped ship when the ship was in South Africa, I believe Cape Town, and he went to his uncle's house in Cape Town, and from there he joined the Royal Navy.
So both of your parents lived in Cardiff. Did they ever tell you about bombing in Cardiff during the Second World War?
Yes, the 2nd of January 1941, was the start of what was known as the Cardiff Blitz. The German bombers, they bombed Cardiff quite severely. My parents' houses, as saying in Grangetown area of Cardiff, were sandwiched between the Cardiff docks, the Penarth docks, the gasworks right at the back of my father's house, and the big Canton Railway depot to the north of Grangetown, right adjacent to my mother's house, where she was living with her parents. The Germans were using three types of bombs mainly. One was the high explosive bomb, that would drop from the aeroplane, free fall, and penetrate through a building or into the ground, blowing up, with the blast coming upwards and causing considerable damage. These were used mainly against industrial targets where they could, although they were falling everywhere and anywhere. The other type of bomb they were using was the incendiary bomb, much smaller device, that would free fall from the aeroplane. It would penetrate a roof space of a house or a building, some of the factory, and it would set alight, start a fire in the roof space, again causing devastating damage by means of fire rather than the high explosive. And then the third type of bomb they were using was the landmine, otherwise known as the parachute bomb. That would fall out from the aeroplane. The descent was slowed by a parachute, so it would explode on contact with the ground or an object, the blast going out sidewards, causing huge devastation to buildings. Now on that evening, I believe 6:30 p.m. on the 2nd of January 1941, a huge landmine came down right on the corner of the road where my father and his family were living. That destroyed the house right on the end of the street, 3 doors away from my parents' house. It destroyed the house across the road on the corner of Ferry Road and Clive Street. killing the families in those two houses. The man that lived next door to my father, he was looking out of his front room window, looking for his wife who was across the road. The blast killed both him and his wife and several other passers-by. The roofs of the houses were all damaged and blown out. All the windows were blown in. And all the houses, they were pockmarked with bits of shrapnel. And even as a boy, I used to look up at all the little damaged bricks at the front of the houses. My father told me how the damage had occurred.
And how many casualties do you know that, Steve, that happened on that night?
In Grangetown alone, there were about 140 people were killed in that single night of bombing. Yeah, the one big incident was at the Holloman's Bakery in nearby Corporation Road. It's halfway up Corporation Road near the Grange Gardens, where the basement of the bakery, a huge room, very, very strongly built, had been reinforced so it could be used as a bomb shelter. And old Mr. Holloman, on hearing the air raid sirens, invited a lot of passers-by down into the basement to take shelter. Unfortunately, that had a direct hit from a high explosive bomb which penetrated through the building, blew up in the basement, killing all 32 people inside that bakery. That was the biggest single incident of loss of life that night. Another landmine, it fell into the gasworks right at the back of my parents' house. It disabled 3 of the big gas holders, but luckily the engineers who were on shift working there managed to shut off all the gas flow, and that prevented the whole place going up in flames. That would have been such a devastating explosion had that gone up.
And your grandparents' house, you said that there were shrapnel marks on the front of the building?
That's right, shrapnel marks all on the front of the building. Luckily, my father and his siblings were still living there, and my grandparents, they were out in the Anderson shelter in the garden, low down in the ground at the back of the house, so they'd been shielded from the blast. Some of the shrapnel had gone right through the front window and embedded itself in the wall in the front room. And every time my father redecorated that room, he had to treat the bit of shrapnel which was still stuck in the wall, make sure it was level, and then treat it so when it was wallpapered, any rust marks wouldn't show through. I expect that bit of shrapnel is probably still in that house now to this day.
And I wonder if the current owners of it know that story.
They might not know the story, but I expect they're wondering why there's a bit of metal stuck in the middle of the wall. You could imagine their face when they saw it. Another bit of damage to the front of the house. The keystone above the front door had been shattered by the blast. And my grandfather was worried the whole front of the house might fall down. So when my Uncle Clifford, who'd been the bricklayer, was home from the army on leave, my father and his other brother, Billy, they constructed a crude scaffolding out of some old ladders which they lashed together with rope, and they sent my Uncle Cliff up the top of this contraption to replace the keystone. Luckily he managed to do that, saving the front of the house. At the rear of our house, at the back of the garden, there was a big lane between us, a railway embankment, and then the gasworks. The gasworks obviously being a prime target for the German bombers. Now, at the bottom of our garden was a large stable and loft. A local greengrocer, he hired the stables from my grandfather and kept his horse and the cart in there. And the stable, loft above the stable, obviously was full of hay for the horse. And my father, he had a little job on the side with a greengrocer where he would look after the horse, water him, feed him, look after. And when he wasn't working on a Saturday, he'd take the horse on his round, delivering groceries to people for the greengrocer. Now, when the bombing raids took place, he was really worried an incendiary bomb might fall through the roof of the loft, setting fire to all the hay and killing the horse. So every time there was a raid, my father, he'd sidle away when my grandfather wasn't looking. He'd go into the stable, to keep an eye on the horse and make sure the horse was okay.
Your dad was only 16 and a half years old when war was declared?
That's right. When it was declared, I'm not sure if he was 15 and a half or 16 and a half. I believe it was 16 and a half years of age. But soon after the Cardiff Blitz, of course, the local defence volunteers, which turned into the Home Guard, was formed. My father volunteered and joined the Home Guard because his occupation was what was known as a reserved occupation. Shipwrights were very much in demand. They were needed for repairing and maintaining all the shipping. Now, the nearby Penarth dock had been used as a base for destroyers where they could be maintained and repaired. My father, being a shipwright on Penarth dock with the old Penarth Pontoon Company, he was kept very busy there and used to tell me of working all day repairing the ships and refurbishing them and then in the evening putting his Home Guard uniform on and then doing duty with the Home Guard all evening and sometimes right through the night as well. It must have been very, very tiring for him.
What was his job during the Home Guard?
I'm not sure exactly what job was. He was only a private, but he used to do duty on the rocket ranges, which were situated on Penarth Head. And those rocket ranges, of course, they were protecting the approaches to Penarth Dock and also to Cardiff Dock as well.
Now, we're going to go back to your mother and father's brothers who actually did participate in the Second World War. Can you give us more idea of what they did and what they experienced?
Yes, my dad's elder brother, Sid, as I say, he was a shipwright and he was away at sea with the Merchant Navy. Obviously, he couldn't take part in any of the actual fighting because he was busy probably working on the convoys back and forth, I presume, across the Atlantic. I don't know too much about his service during the war, but I did know that my father and his parents were very worried about his safety all the time because the amount of ships which were being sunk. So he would have been right in that during the Battle of the Atlantic. My other uncle, my Uncle Billy, as I say, he was a shipwright. I believe he was working on Cardiff docks. So he'd been very, very busy. Now my Uncle Clifford, who was a bricklayer, as I said, he had been conscripted to join the army and he was with the Welsh Regiment. And I do remember a story that he was fighting in Italy with his battalion and he got an awful ear infection and consequently he'd been sent back to the medical unit for the infection to be treated and cleared up, and while he was away most of his platoon had been killed during fighting. Although he always suffered with his hearing, he just felt so guilty the rest of his life of close friends in his platoon having been killed, and yet he wasn't there with him and he'd survived. And he carried that guilt with him, as I say, for the rest of his life. Now, going to my mother's family, her two brothers, the eldest, my Uncle Harry, he was in the Territorial Army in the Royal Signals. So on war being declared, he was immediately mobilised and he was sent over to France. And he was fighting, I know, in France with his unit, and he became part of the rear guard at Dunkirk, which meant when his unit had run out of ammunition, they had no way back, no way to escape because they were still fairly deep in France. He was very lucky that he was captured, along with his comrades, by the regular German army. They were taken prisoner and he ended up in a prison war camp for most of the war in Poland. One of the stories my Uncle Harry told me, whilst he was a prisoner of war in Poland, he used to form part of a work party and used to go out to local farms, labouring on the farms. And during one of these, what became known as Uncle Harry's Great Escape, after having his lunch, he decided to secrete himself into a ditch and have a little snooze. When he woke up, the work party had gone. They'd been taken back to the prison of war camp. There he was, all on his own, secreted in this ditch. He didn't know what to do. Of course, he panicked. He didn't know exactly where he was. No maps, no money. So he hid throughout the rest of the day, throughout the following night, trying to work out what to do. The next day, lo and behold, the same work party returned and resumed labouring duties on that farm. He managed to rejoin them, and absolutely amazed to find out he hadn't been reported as missing. No one had noticed he'd gone, apart from his close friends. So he was able then to stay with them and go back to the prisoner of war camp. He always feared that he'd been tracked down and maybe shot for escaping. But he was so lucky in that respect. My mother's other brother, my Uncle Charlie, as I say, when war broke out, he was working on the ship in the Merchant Navy. He was an able seaman. He'd managed to jump ship while the ship was in South Africa, in Cape Town. He'd made his way to his uncle's house, and from there he joined the Royal Navy. And he spent the war on cruisers, initially in the Indian Ocean. They were escorting convoys from the Indian Ocean to Britain. During the Bismarck incident, my Uncle Charlie was on HMS Dorsetshire, County Class cruiser. And during the convoy, when the convoy reached Gibraltar, his ship was sent from the convoy to help in the hunt for the Bismarck. Now, the Bismarck had already been caught up by the HMS King George V and the HMS Rodney, and they'd reduced the Bismarck to a blazing wreck. The Dorsetshire was ordered in close to the Bismarck to finish it off with torpedoes. So my Uncle Charlie, being a deck gunner, I believe he was in charge of an Oerlikon submachine cannon, the 20mm cannon. He saw the entirety of the Bismarck on fire, being struck by the torpedoes, and then the Dorsetshire were ordered then to pick up as many survivors from the Bismarck as they could. I always remember Uncle Charlie telling me, whilst they were picking up survivors, torpedo tracks were seen heading towards the Dorsetshire, so the Dorsetshire just had to stop what they were doing and run for it, obviously feeling they were under attack by enemy submarines. And he told me, night after night, amongst his crew, he'd never seen so many grown men crying night after night because they'd left all those German sailors to their doom in the sea. But they had no option, otherwise they'd have been with them. After the Bismarck incident, the Dorsetshire went up, I believe, to Newcastle Way, where it was put into dry dock for maintenance and refit. Uncle Charlie, he was transferred to another cruiser, and I believe he was the rest of the war. He was on the Russian Arctic convoys. And he used to tell me how cold it was during the winter months, and he used to have to crawl out onto the superstructure, knocking off the huge amounts of ice that were forming all over the ship. Otherwise the ship would have been made very, very top heavy with ice and become unstable. And can you imagine getting up early in the morning, crawling out on that deck, crawling up the superstructure with a hammer and smashing away at the ice? Oh, that must have been freezing. Not a job I would have fancied doing.
Nor me.
Yes, and what happened to the Dorsetshire, whilst my Uncle Charlie and his original crewmates had been assigned to other cruisers, the Dorsetshire, when it finished maintenance, went back down to the Indian Ocean, where it was sunk with a huge loss of life by the Japanese Navy.
I think some of your uncles had some lucky escapes there, Steve.
Oh, they certainly did. They certainly did.
Now, talking of your uncles, their parents, your grandparents, you know, having their sons out at war must have been a really worrying time. I mean, they had one as a prisoner of war and one out on the cruisers. Did you know, did they ever say much to you about that?
No, my grandparents never really talked to me about the war. They just didn't talk about things. The incidents really, really upset them. But my grandmother, my mother's mother, she did tell me that when they were living in Tennant Street, which was adjacent to the Cardiff Canton diesel depot, in those days, of course, it wasn't diesel depot. I say that for modern reference. It was a big steam locomotive depot. That was a big target for the Germans as well, because there's such a concentration of railway lines and railway maintenance. trying to export all that coal from the South Wales valleys out of Cardiff docks and the other South Wales ports. So they felt very, very unsafe living in a house so near an obvious target. So they moved away from Tennant Street to another area of Grangetown. However, during the bombing raid, they were in the air raid shelter when that house was severely damaged and written off by German bombing. They were rehoused to another area of Cardiff, the Portmanor Road area of Cardiff, which was right adjacent to the big steel works and the Cardiff docks. Another air raid, they were out in the Anderson shelter at that location. That house was hit by a bomb and destroyed. So they were rehoused another time out to the Ely area of Cardiff. And it was absolutely ironic that the house they'd moved away from for safety, that had been untouched all through the war and still stands today.
That is a great story. Now, your uncle Harry, who was a prisoner of war.
Yes, my Uncle Harry, prisoner of war, and my grandparents, his parents, didn't know anything of where he was for about 3 years. All they knew, he was missing in action and hadn't been brought back after Dunkirk, and they didn't have a clue where he was, till one day a letter arrived from the Red Cross, letting them know he was a prisoner of war. And he did send them a letter addressed to my Uncle Charlie. In the letter he was asking, could they send him a housewife, which was a sewing kit, and also could they send him a spare revolver, a Webley service revolver. Somehow that must have got past the German intelligence officers. Yeah, that caused quite a bit of hilarity.
Now, we know that your father joined the Home Guard during the war, and he was only a teenager. What part did your mum play during the war effort?
Yes, my mother, she joined the Women's Land Army, and she spent the war working on farms just to the north of Cardiff. And she used to tell me about the rationing. She said, well, one instance, you couldn't get sweets, not for love nor money. And if word went round, a shop had a supply of sweets of some description. The queue was that big. If you joined the queue to buy some of the sweets, by the time you got to the front door of the shop, they'd sold out. And that was the same with many a commodity which was rationed. A lot of the unrationed food used to sell out very quickly. Because you could imagine, the little ration you were allowed, you'd make it up with whatever veg and fruit was available in the shops, and that would soon sell out. And they used to tell me that if they ran short of food by the end of the week, at least the chip shops were still open. You could still buy fish and chips. They had never been rationed, so at least you could get one hot meal.
Yeah, I believe that the government didn't ration fish and chips because they needed to keep the public's morale up. So that was never put on ration.
That's right, that's one thing Churchill was very, very positive about. The fish and chip shops would never be closed down. As he used to say, we live on an island surrounded by the sea. There is plenty of fish in that sea. We can grow our own potatoes, so there can always be a hot meal available in the chip shop, so they would never shut down. Although you still have to buy them, at least you could still get that food.
Steve, this year we celebrate the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Now, did your parents ever tell you anything about how they celebrated VE Day?
Yeah, they told me there was much rejoicing all amongst the neighbourhood. A lot of their friends and neighbours, they'd lost people in the war, but generally the population were just so relieved the war had ended. There'd be no more killing. My grandparents, as I say, never really talked about the war, apart from they were just so overjoyed to see that their son's coming back home.
Especially the one who was a prisoner of war.
Especially Uncle Harry was a prisoner of war. Yes, indeed. Yes, there were street parties. Oh, there was many joyous occasions.
Right, thank you very much, Steve, for regaling all those stories from your parents and your grandparents. So on behalf of Barry War Museum and Heritage Centre, thank you.
Thank you for listening to me.